Clementine Vale had drawn 47 versions of falling in love, and had never once experienced a single one. She knew this because the sketchbooks were stacked beside her drafting table in chronological order, a personal archive of romantic scenes she'd invented for other people's stories. Couples meeting under train station clocks, hands brushing across library shelves, foreheads pressed together in the pale blue hour before sunrise. 47 variations on a theme she'd studied the way a musicologist might study a symphony they'd never heard performed live. With academic precision, genuine fascination, and a quiet, gnawing suspicion that no amount of study would ever substitute for the thing itself. If you've ever rooted for a love story that felt almost too real to be fiction, like it was pulling something out of you that you'd buried a long time ago, hit like and subscribe. This one's going to matter. The sketchbook currently open on her desk was number 48. It was blank. This was, in itself, unusual. Cleo's sketchbooks did not stay blank for long. She had an almost pathological relationship with empty pages. Something about their white, untouched surface activated a kind of low-grade panic in her nervous system, a visual static that only quieted when she put pencil to paper. She drew when she was anxious. She drew when she was bored. She drew in the margins of grocery lists and on the paper sleeves of coffee cups, and, once, in a moment she was not proud of, across the back of someone else's dry-cleaning receipt, while waiting in line at the pharmacy. Drawing was, for Clementine Vale, less a hobby than a coping mechanism, a way of converting the formless noise of the world into something she could look at and understand. But sketchbook 48 had been sitting open and blank on her drafting table for 11 days. She'd been avoiding it. Not because she had nothing to draw. She had everything to draw. Burlington in early October was practically begging to be illustrated, all burning maples and slanted gold light and that particular quality of New England sky that existed only in autumn, a blue so saturated it looked photoshopped, offensive in its perfection. Her studio apartment on Lakeview Terrace had a bay window that faced west, and every evening for the past 2 weeks she'd sat in the window seat watching the sun go down over Lake Champlain, in colors so violent and extravagant that they felt like a personal affront to anyone who claimed life was mundane. She had not drawn any of it. What she had done, instead, was sit at her drafting table and stare at the blank page and think, with increasing frequency and a discomfort she was only beginning to be honest about Vesper Thorne. This was not unusual in the way that it probably should have been. Cleo thought about Vesper the way people thought about the weather, constantly, reflexively, in a way so habituated that she'd long since stopped registering it as a choice. Vesper was her best friend of 9 years, the person whose contact photo in her phone was set to a slightly out-of-focus picture from a hiking trip in 2019, where Vesper was laughing at something off-camera with her head thrown back and her hair coming loose from its braid, a completely candid shot that Cleo had taken without Vesper knowing and had never told her about. Vesper was the person she called when she got a new illustration commission, when she was anxious about a deadline, when she found a documentary she thought was interesting, when she tried a new recipe that turned out badly, when she had a dream she couldn't stop thinking about. Vesper was the first person Cleo wanted to talk to in the mornings, and the last voice she wanted to hear before she fell asleep. This, Cleo had always told herself, was what best friendship looked like, when you did it right. She was starting to wonder if that explanation had been doing a lot of heavy lifting for a very long time. The thought arrived with the particular clarity of something that had been waiting patiently in a back room while you pretended not to notice it, and then simply walked through the door one morning when you'd forgotten to lock it. It didn't announce itself dramatically. It didn't come with music or revelation or the cinematic swell of strings that Cleo had always drawn in the background of her fictional love scenes. It came quietly, the way most true things did. On a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of October, while she was sitting at her drafting table with a cup of green tea gone cold at her elbow and 48 blank pages in front of her, thinking about the exact quality of Vesper's laugh and why she kept drawing her without meaning to in the margins of her planning notes. She looked down at the notepad she'd been using to jot down client feedback for a new project. In the bottom right corner, rendered in the quick, economical lines she used when she wasn't paying conscious attention to what her hand was doing, was a face. Long nose, strong jaw, dark eyes under heavy brows, slightly narrowed in that characteristic expression Cleo had spent 9 years cataloging. The one that meant, "I am listening to you more carefully than you think I am." Hair pulled back, a few strands escaping at the temple, a pen tucked behind one ear. She'd drawn Vesper again. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she turned the notepad face down on the desk, picked up her cold tea, took a long sip of it, and said, out loud, to no one, "Okay, that's fine. That's absolutely fine." It was, of course, not fine. She'd met Vesper in the fall of their junior year at the University of Vermont, in a semiotics elective that neither of them had signed up for voluntarily. Cleo had been double-booked by a registration error and was too anxious to complain to the department. Vesper had enrolled because she'd misread the course title and thought it was about urban design. They'd discovered this mutual reluctance approximately 40 minutes into the first lecture, communicated entirely through a series of increasingly incredulous glances across the seminar table, and had gone for coffee afterward, with the easy, immediate intimacy of people who recognize something of themselves in a stranger. They were, in almost every measurable way, opposites. Cleo was quiet where Vesper was direct. Cleo made decisions by feel, by instinct, by the particular texture of a moment. She chose her illustration projects based on which brief made something move in her chest. She picked restaurants by standing outside and looking at the light through the window, and deciding if it felt right. She organized her workspace by a system that looked like chaos, but contained its own internal logic, a logic she couldn't fully articulate, but could always navigate. She existed in the world the way water existed, taking the shape of whatever container she found herself in, flowing around obstacles, finding the lowest point and settling there. Vesper was an architecture of certainties. She made decisions the way she designed event spaces, with structural integrity as the baseline, every element justified by function, nothing left to chance. She was a professional event architect, which was a real career she had built from scratch, and which sounded, to people who didn't understand it, like a fancy term for party planner, a description that caused a very specific expression to cross Vesper's face. A controlled, patient, profoundly unimpressed stillness, like a mathematician being asked if they were good at Sudoku. Vesper designed experiences. She thought about how people moved through spaces, how light affected mood, how the sequence of a night could build toward a particular emotional peak, the way a piece of music built toward its resolution. She had a master's degree in spatial design and an almost supernatural ability to walk into any environment and immediately identify what was wrong with it. She had, over the course of 9 years, made Cleo's life measurably better in approximately 1,000 specific, practical ways. She'd helped her negotiate her first serious illustration contract. She'd researched the neighborhood before Cleo signed the lease on her current apartment. She'd sent her, without comment or explanation, a list of 7 recommended therapists the winter Cleo had gone quiet in a way that was different from her regular quiet, and had driven her to the first appointment and waited outside with coffee. Cleo had, over the same period, made Vesper's life better in ways that were harder to quantify, but which Vesper seemed to need just as badly. She'd taught her how to sit with a decision without forcing it to resolution. She'd listened, really listened, to the things Vesper said between the lines of what she was actually saying. She'd been the person who noticed when Vesper was performing capability, when the efficiency and the competence were armor rather than character, and who refused to accept the performance at face value. They had, by any reasonable assessment, one of the best friendships either of them had ever had. Which was why, Cleo thought, turning the notepad back over and looking at the small sketch of Vesper's face and feeling something complicated move through her chest, it was probably important not to make things weird. She was still sitting with this resolution, cold tea in hand, when her front door opened. She didn't have a doorbell, because she'd removed the battery from it 3 years ago when it started ringing at odd hours, and she hadn't gotten around to replacing it. Her friends all had a key, which was a level of trust that had seemed reasonable when she'd issued the keys, but which she acknowledged created a certain vulnerability to surprise entrances. She had, over the years, developed the ability to identify who was entering her apartment by the specific character of the door opening. Marcus came in fast and careless, letting the door bounce against the stopper. Ji-young knocked twice, and then immediately opened it without waiting. Her downstairs neighbor, who had an emergency key for plant watering purposes, always hesitated on the threshold, announcing himself with a throat clear. Vesper opened doors the way she did everything else, with purpose. 2 seconds from key and lock to door, fully open, clean and direct, no wasted motion. "I've been thinking," Vesper said without preamble, which was how most of her best sentences started. She was wearing her work clothes, tailored charcoal trousers, a rust-colored turtleneck that Cleo had once told her looked good against her skin, and which she had apparently been wearing more frequently since, and she had her work bag over one shoulder, the large structured one that held her tablet and her color-coded planning folders, and approximately 11 different kinds of cable, because Vesper believed in preparedness the way other people believed in God. She had her hair up in a loose chignon, the kind that looked casual, but which Cleo knew involved more bobby pins than most people used in a month, and there was a brightness in her eyes that Cleo recognized as the specific alertness Vesper got when she had a plan she was excited about. Cleo instinctively turned the notepad face down again. "Okay," she said. "Come in." "I'm already in," Vesper said. "Already in." She set her bag down on the kitchen counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been setting her bag down on Cleo's kitchen counter for 9 years and had long since located the optimal spot. She pulled out her tablet. She looked at Cleo with an expression that contained, in equal measure, warmth, determination, and a very small amount of carefully managed impatience. "I want to plan your first date," she said. Cleo put her tea down. "I've been on dates," she said. "You've been on situations," Vesper said, pulling up something on her tablet. "That thing with the guy from your watercolor class where you got coffee and then both went home because it rained doesn't count. The birthday party where you and Isabel spent 2 hours in the kitchen talking about Middlemarch doesn't count. The thing last spring. That absolutely counts. Cleo." Vesper looked at her with patience and love, and an absolutely unshakable certainty. "You told me afterward that you'd spent most of the evening planning what you were going to draw when you got home." A pause. "The light was interesting," Cleo said, slightly defensively. "I know," Vesper said, and her voice was so entirely free of judgment that Cleo felt, as she often did in these moments, something in her chest go a little soft. "That's why I want to help." She set the tablet on the drafting table. Cleo moved the face-down notepad slightly to the left and turned the screen toward her. On it was a document titled Project CV First Real Date, with a header in Vesper's preferred font, a subheader reading Draft 3, Revised, and a timeline broken into 30-minute increments. Cleo looked at it. "You've been working on this," she said. "I started it in August," Vesper said. "Vesper. I wanted to get it right." She said this the same way she said everything, directly, without apology, as though the statement contained its own complete justification. "You deserve to have it right." Cleo looked at the document for a long moment. It was, she thought, typical of Vesper in the best and most complicated way. The sheer architecture of care contained in a planning document. The 30-minute increments, the Draft 3, Revised. The 2 months of quiet, dedicated thought that had gone into something she hadn't even asked for, given to her now as simply as a gift left on a table. She looked at the timeline. Maple and Bean Cafe, 10 a.m., Lakeside Walk, Battery Park, 11, lunch, Hen of the Wood, 12:30, afternoon, TBD, weather dependent, evening, Il Giardino, 6:30, reservations confirmed. "You made reservations," Cleo said. "I know someone," Vesper said. "Of course you do." Cleo looked up. "Who's the date?" Vesper reached into her work bag, the side pocket, which contained a small red notebook Cleo had never been allowed to look inside, and produced a printed sheet of paper with the quietly ceremonial air of someone presenting evidence. She set it on the drafting table beside the tablet. "His name is Oliver Marsh," she said. "He's a landscape architect. He likes hiking, contemporary fiction, and documentary film. He has a dog named after a Tarkovsky movie, which I know you'll find charming. He is thoughtful, patient, and according to 3 independent sources." "You interviewed people about him?" "I asked questions," Vesper said. "He's also," she continued, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing their words very precisely, "exactly the kind of quiet that matches your kind of quiet. I think you'll like him." Cleo looked at the photograph on the printed sheet. Oliver Marsh was, objectively, a very pleasant-looking person, with the kind of warm, open face that suggested emotional availability and a good relationship with the outdoors. He had kind eyes. He was looking at the camera like someone who found eye contact easy. She felt nothing. This was not, she reminded herself firmly, a data point. "You've thought about everything," she said. "That's what I do," Vesper said. She was already pulling up the weather forecast on her tablet, running calculations. "Saturday is the best day. The light will be good for the lakeside walk, and I've confirmed Il Giardino's private dining room for the evening in case you want to move things that direction." She looked up. "What do you think?" Cleo thought about the blank pages of Sketchbook 48. She thought about the face she kept drawing in notepad margins without intending to. She thought about the particular quality of Vesper's attention when she was working on something she cared about. The way she went still and focused. The way the rest of the world seemed to arrange itself quietly around her concentration. The way she looked right now, standing at Cleo's drafting table with her tablet and her 3 independent sources, and 2 months of quiet, loving work. She thought about how much easier it would be if the thing moving in her chest were about Oliver Marsh, with his kind eyes and his Tarkovsky dog. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." The Thursday before the date, Vesper came over with a bottle of wine and an agenda. This was not, in itself, remarkable. Vesper had a gift for making structured things feel warm. She brought agendas the way other people brought dessert, as an act of hospitality rather than administration. She uncorked the wine, a Pinot Noir she'd chosen deliberately, from a vineyard in the Champlain Valley whose tasting notes she'd read twice before purchasing, poured 2 glasses, and set her tablet on Cleo's coffee table, with the air of someone beginning a meeting they'd been looking forward to. "Logistics first," she said, sitting cross-legged on Cleo's couch with her wine glass balanced on her knee. A practiced, easy comfort, the particular posture of someone who had been sitting on this specific couch for years and knew exactly how it held a body. "Then we talk through the evening arc, and then we do the thing where I try to anticipate every possible complication, and you tell me I'm being paranoid." "You're being paranoid," Cleo said immediately. "We haven't started yet. I'm getting ahead of the process." Vesper smiled. It was a real one, not the professional smile she used at client consultations, which was warm but controlled, calibrated for the right impression, but the one she saved for moments when something genuinely pleased her. It reached her eyes and changed the whole configuration of her face, and Cleo had always thought that one of the more unfortunate aspects of having a very attractive best friend was that you developed an involuntary expertise in the specific variations of their expressions. "Saturday morning," Vesper began, "I'll wear what I want to wear," Cleo said. "Obviously, but I want to propose the teal sweater." She held up a hand before Cleo could respond. "The wool one with the slight sheen. It does what your eyes do." Cleo stopped. "The teal sweater," she repeated. "It brings out the green." Vesper was already scrolling on her tablet. "I looked at Oliver's Instagram." "You looked at his Instagram?" "For professional purposes. He's outdoorsy, but he pays attention to aesthetics. He'll notice the sweater." She paused. "Also your hair down, I think. You always think you look better with it up, but you're wrong. Cleo took a sip of wine and held it in her mouth for a moment. Vesper, she said. What? When you say the teal sweater brings out the green. Your eyes, Vesper said. She was still looking at the tablet. They go more green than gray when you wear that color. It's a good effect. Cleo's eyes were green-gray. She'd had them for 31 years, and had never particularly thought about what they did in relation to what she was wearing, because she'd never had cause to pay that close attention to herself. It was unusual, she thought, to have someone who had paid that kind of attention to her, someone who knew that her eyes changed color depending on what she wore, not because they'd researched it, but because they'd simply been watching, for years, in the ordinary way of being present for someone. She filed this observation under the growing internal category she was currently labeling, with increasing desperation. Things that are normal parts of close friendship and don't mean anything. Okay, she said. The teal sweater. Good. Vesper made a small note. Now, the date itself. Maple and bean is low pressure, which is intentional. You're going to want a table by the window. I've already arranged it, because you're more comfortable when you can see the outside. It gives you something to reference if the conversation gets awkward. Cleo blinked. How do you? You always sit by the window, Vesper said, with the easy certainty of someone stating weather patterns. Every cafe we've been to together, for 9 years. You position yourself so you can see the street. I don't know if you know you do it. She looked up. Do you know you do it? Cleo opened her mouth, closed it. No, she admitted. I didn't know I did that. You do. Vesper said it without inflection, not with the gentle condescension of someone who delighted in knowing things other people didn't know about themselves, but with the simple directness of someone who had paid attention because paying attention to Cleo was something they did. I've requested the corner table, the one on the east side. More natural light in the morning. Cleo sat with this. There was a particular experience, she thought, that existed in the overlap between being deeply known and being unable to fully account for what that knowledge felt like. She'd felt it before in smaller doses, when Vesper knew, without being told, that she was going to cancel a commitment before Cleo herself knew, and had already quietly rearranged things to make it easier. When Vesper texted her the name of a book on a Tuesday morning with no explanation, and Cleo read it and realized it was the exact book she'd needed for a project she hadn't told anyone about. When Vesper noticed, 3 conversations before Cleo did, being known by Vesper was one of the most consistent features of Cleo's adult life. She'd always experienced it as a comfort, a home-like quality, the relief of a place where you didn't have to explain yourself. She was starting to notice, sitting on her couch on a Thursday evening in October with a glass of good wine, and the particular unshakable attention of her best friend, directed entirely at the project of giving her a perfect first date. That comfort and longing felt, from certain angles, nearly identical. The walk at Battery Park, Vesper was saying, scrolling through her plan. I've checked the path conditions. Should be good for Saturday. The maples along the eastern trail are at peak color right now. She paused, something shifting slightly in her expression. I thought you might want to draw something afterward. You can bring the small sketchbook. You thought I might want to draw, Cleo said. You'll see things during the walk that you'll want to remember, Vesper said simply. You always do. Cleo looked at her, the wine glass warm in her hands, the lamp in the corner throwing honey-colored light across the room. Vesper with her tablet and her careful notes and 9 years of quiet, accumulated attention. Vesper, she said, and her voice came out softer than she'd intended. Thank you. She meant it to land simply, the way Vesper gave things, directly, without fuss. But it came out weighted, with more underneath it than the 2 words could cleanly carry, and she watched Vesper look up from the tablet and meet her eyes and hold them for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. It's what I do, Vesper said. It was the same thing she'd said on Tuesday, when she'd first presented the plan. It landed differently now, in the lamplit Thursday quiet, with the wine and the proximity and the weight of everything Cleo wasn't saying, pressing gently against the inside of her chest. Vesper looked back at the tablet. "Lunch at Hen of the Wood," she said. "The beef tartare is a reasonable choice if he's not vegetarian. I've confirmed he's not. But I'd recommend starting with the mushroom toast, because it's the best thing on the menu, and first impressions matter." "First impressions," Cleo said. "You'll want the conversation to have hit a natural rhythm by lunch," Vesper continued. "The maple and bean portion is for establishing comfort. By the walk, you'll know if you like him. By lunch, you'll know if it's worth pursuing the evening." "And if I don't?" Vesper looked up. "Don't what?" "Know if it's worth pursuing by lunch." "Then you tell me, and I recalibrate." She said this with complete seriousness. "I'm going to be at Maple and Bean during the morning, in case you need—" "You're going to be there?" "At a separate table," Vesper said, in the tone of someone explaining something self-evidently reasonable. "Out of eyeline, just in case." "In case of what?" "In case something goes wrong and you need an exit strategy." She seemed to consider whether to say the next thing. "Or in case things go well and you want to signal me and I can, I don't know, make myself scarce." A very small, very careful pause. "I just want to be nearby." Cleo looked at her best friend, this precise, devoted, baffling woman who had spent 2 months planning a date for someone else, who had arranged reservations and checked weather forecasts and identified the optimal lighting conditions for a lakeside walk and knew which cafe table would make Cleo feel safest. This woman who wanted to be nearby just in case, for a date she wasn't even on. Something in Cleo's chest did a very complicated thing. She picked up her wine and looked at it. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'm glad you'll be there." Friday arrived with the particular nervous energy of days that precede significant things. Cleo woke early and lay in bed for 20 minutes looking at the ceiling, conducting an internal inventory. She felt something. It was hard to categorize. Not quite excitement. Not quite dread. A kind of low-level alertness, like the feeling before a thunderstorm, when the air pressure changes and something in your body registers the shift before your mind has caught up. She got up and made coffee and sat in the window seat with it, watching Lake Champlain in the early morning gray. The water was flat and pewter-colored, barely distinguishable from the sky. A heron stood at the edge of the near bank, absolutely still, waiting with the patience of something that had no concept of wasted time. She thought about Oliver Marsh, and his kind eyes, and his Tarkovsky-named dog. She tried, quite deliberately, to feel something about this. She constructed a mental image of Saturday morning, Maple and Bean, the teal sweater, the corner table with good light, Oliver Marsh across from her, warm and outdoorsy and thoughtful. A good conversation. The walk at Battery Park with the maples at peak color. Lunch. The evening, possibly. She waited. The heron moved. Her phone buzzed. Morning. Teal sweater is hanging on your coat rack. I dropped it off. Dry cleaned. It needed it. Weather tomorrow. Clear. 52 degrees. Perfect. Sleep well. V. Cleo read this message 3 times. She looked at the coat rack by the door. The teal sweater was, in fact, hanging there, neatly folded over the topmost hook, obviously freshly cleaned and pressed. Vesper had come by that morning, early enough that Cleo was still in bed, had presumably used her key, had hung the sweater, and had left again. She had done this quietly, without waking her, without making it a thing. Just hung the sweater and gone. Cleo put her coffee cup down on the window seat cushion and pressed her palm flat against her sternum. She stayed like that for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and typed, "You dry cleaned my sweater." The reply came in under a minute. It had a coffee stain on the left sleeve. You wouldn't have noticed. I notice things. You notice things in other people. You're professionally blind to your own coffee stains. Cleo laughed, a short surprised sound in the quiet morning apartment. She typed, "Thank you." Vesper replied, "Big day tomorrow. Eat something real for breakfast." Saturday morning. Cleo was dressed by 9. The teal sweater was, as Vesper had predicted, doing something entirely unreasonable to her eyes, and she'd spent longer than she usually would, looking at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to identify what exactly the effect was and why Vesper had noticed it before she had. Her hair was down. She had, without entirely meaning to, dried it the way Vesper had shown her once, with her head flipped forward and the diffuser attachment, which gave it a shape that she couldn't achieve any other way, and which she only did for occasions that felt like they required her best self. She picked up the small sketchbook, the one she used for travel, with the ivory pages and the elastic closure, and tucked it into her bag without thinking. Then she thought about it. Then she left it in the bag. Maple and Bean was a 12-minute walk from her apartment. She knew this with the precision of someone who had walked it 100 times, in every season, usually with Vesper beside her, though the walks were different in each direction. The morning walks quieter and more inward. The evening walks looser, more expansive, both of them more willing to take detours and slow down. She arrived at 9:52 and stood outside for a moment, looking at the light through the window. The light was warm. It had that amber quality that October mornings had in Burlington, honey-colored and slanted, making everything look slightly more vivid than usual, like the world had increased its own saturation for the occasion. Through the glass, she could see the interior of the cafe: exposed brick, wooden tables, a chalkboard menu, the particular comfortable lived-in quality of a place that had been good for a long time. And she could see, at a table near the back, in the most unobtrusive position available, while still maintaining a clear sightline to the door, a woman in a dark green jacket looking at a tablet with an expression of concentrated focus. Vesper. She was already there. Cleo stood on the sidewalk and looked at her through the glass for a moment, the way she looked when she thought she wasn't being observed, which was subtly different from how she looked when she knew she was. There was a looseness in her posture, a quality of genuine absorption. She was frowning slightly at the tablet screen, the small vertical crease between her brows that Cleo had drawn from memory so many times she could reproduce it exactly without a reference. She had her coffee cup close to hand, and she was wearing the dark green jacket, which was relatively new, and there was something in the way she was sitting, contained, attentive, privately preparing, that looked less like someone waiting to supervise an event and more like someone bracing themselves for something they were a little afraid of. Cleo noticed this. She filed it. The door of the cafe opened and a man came out, and Cleo stepped back to let him pass. And then she looked up and saw, approaching from the north on the sidewalk, a person who matched the photograph on Vesper's printed sheet very closely. Oliver Marsh. Kind eyes. He was wearing a navy jacket and carrying a reusable cup, and he had a slightly self-conscious energy about him that Cleo recognized as the particular nervousness of someone who cared about making a good impression. "Clementine?" he said, which was how she knew he'd been briefed on her name, since no one who was guessing would have started there. "Cleo," she said. "Hi." "Hi." He smiled. It was, in fact, a warm smile, the kind that moved into his eyes without effort. "This feels a little formal, doesn't it? The whole—" He made a slight gesture that seemed to encompass the arranged quality of the morning. "It's very well organized," Cleo agreed. "Your friend is thorough." "She really is," Cleo said. And she glanced, involuntarily, through the cafe window and saw the back of Vesper's head, the chignon slightly looser than usual, the dark green jacket, and felt the low-frequency signal in her chest pulse once, quietly, like a sonar ping off something solid. They went inside. Oliver Marsh was, exactly as Vesper had predicted, a pleasant person to talk to. He was thoughtful without being performatively so, which Cleo had always found more impressive than the alternative. He asked real questions. Not the polite, interrogative questions that served as social filler, but questions that indicated he'd been listening to the previous answer and had found something in it worth following. He was interested in her illustration work in the way of someone who was genuinely curious about process, not just output, and he had opinions about documentary film that were specific enough to reveal actual engagement with the subject. He was, in every technical sense, exactly what the situation called for. Cleo talked to him and enjoyed talking to him and smiled genuinely at things he said that were genuinely worth smiling at. And all of this happened in the pleasant, unforced way that good conversation happened, and she could feel, underneath all of it, running like a current beneath still water, the continuous awareness of the woman sitting at the table near the back wall. She didn't look. She was disciplined about not looking. But she was aware, in the way she was aware of gravity, constantly, without effort, as a basic fact of the environment, of exactly where in the room Vesper was. At one point, Oliver said something about light in the mountains, and she nodded and said something in response, and she thought she heard, from the direction of the back table, the particular quiet sound of a tablet screen being set down. She didn't look. At another point, she said something that made Oliver laugh, genuinely, a real laugh, and she saw, in her peripheral vision, something shift at the back of the room. She still didn't look. The coffee was good. The corner table was, as Vesper had noted, better than the alternatives. The conversation was the kind that could have gone longer if the morning hadn't been structured around going somewhere next. When they stood to leave, Cleo glanced, once, toward the back of the cafe. Vesper was looking at her tablet, but the coffee cup was cold. Cleo could tell somehow, by the angle at which it was being held, and the frown between her brows had a quality that was not, Cleo thought, professional concentration. She looked like someone working very hard at pretending she was fine. Cleo thought about that all the way to Battery Park. The walk was beautiful. This was unavoidable. Burlington in peak October was the kind of landscape that demanded attention, and the trail along the eastern edge of Battery Park delivered it in every direction. The lake pewter and shining, the maples in full theatrical color, the particular quality of light that came through turning leaves and painted the ground in shades that didn't have names. Just the felt sense of something brief and extraordinary. Oliver was good company on the walk. He noticed things, which Cleo appreciated. He had the quiet, attentive quality of someone who'd spent time outdoors alone and had learned the patience of it. Cleo opened her small sketchbook. She drew the maples. She drew the shoreline. She drew the light on the water, the way it moved. She drew, in the top right corner of the page, in the quick absent lines of her most unconscious work, the particular posture of someone sitting at a cafe table with a tablet, head slightly bent, the loose escape of hair at the temple. She closed the sketchbook. Oliver glanced at it. "Can I see?" She hesitated. She almost said no. Her sketchbooks were private in the way her internal life was private, not hidden but not offered automatically. And then she turned to the previous page, the one with the maples and the light and the shoreline, and handed it to him. He looked at it for a moment with real attention. "You see differently than most people," he said. Not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation, made carefully. "These," he indicated the trees. "They're not just the trees. They're the air around the trees, the space." "I'm more interested in what things do to their surroundings," Cleo said, "than what they look like on their own." She heard herself say this and felt it land somewhere in her own chest before it finished arriving in the world. Oliver handed the sketchbook back. "Your friend?" he said after a moment. "Vesper. She cares about you a lot." Cleo looked at the lake. "Yeah," she said. "I don't mean that awkwardly," he said. I've done a few of these setups, and usually you can tell when someone is doing it out of social obligation. This didn't feel like that. He paused. The reservations. The planned route. I looked up the restaurant she booked. It takes 3 weeks for a weekend reservation. She knows people, Cleo said. She put a lot into this, Oliver said simply. That's a particular kind of caring. I just wanted to acknowledge it. Cleo looked at the maples. They were the color of the interior of something, the inside of warmth, if warmth had a color, which she had always thought it did, and which she had never been able to draw accurately, though she kept trying. Yeah, she said again. It is. By the time they arrived at Hen of the Wood, Cleo had decided 2 things. The first, she liked Oliver Marsh genuinely, the way she liked good films, and interesting conversations and morning light, with appreciation and no urgency, with the warmth of something valuable encountered without necessity. The second, she was not, and was not going to be, in love with Oliver Marsh. This was not his fault. It was not the result of any inadequacy in Vesper's planning, or any failure of the date itself, which was proceeding almost exactly as designed, and which was, by any objective measure, a lovely Saturday in October with a thoughtful person who was interested in the right things. The problem, if it was a problem, if she was willing to call it that, was not the date. The problem was the current that ran underneath the date, the low-frequency awareness she'd been carrying all morning like a frequency she couldn't tune out, the small drawing in the corner of her sketchbook page, the dry-cleaned sweater on the coat rack. The problem, which she sat with over the mushroom toast at Hen of the Wood while Oliver talked about a hiking trail in the Northeast Kingdom, and she responded with appropriate attentiveness, was that all of Vesper's care for this date, the 3 weeks of reservation making, the research, the checked weather forecasts, the corner table with the morning light, had felt, every time she'd encountered a piece of it, you planned the date you wanted to have with me. The thought arrived the same way it had arrived a week ago on the Tuesday afternoon with the notepad margin sketch. Quietly, without drama, as something that had been waiting for the right moment to simply be acknowledged. She put down her fork. She looked at the window. Outside, the October light was doing everything October light in Burlington did. Everything extravagant and brief, the world insisting on being noticed. Be here now, be here now. Her phone, face up on the table beside her bread plate, lit up. A text from Vesper. How's it going? Cleo looked at the 3 words for a moment. She looked at the window. She typed, Where are you right now? A pause. Then, walked to the waterfront. Couldn't stay in the cafe for 3 hours. Cleo looked at this. Why not? A longer pause. I needed some air. She thought about Vesper on the waterfront, the dark green jacket, the tablet probably in her bag, standing where Cleo stood every morning looking at the lake. She thought about the expression she'd caught at the back of the cafe before they'd left. The cold coffee and the particular quality of that frown. She thought about Vesper, who planned everything, who had prepared for every contingency, who had thought of the corner table and the morning light and the mushroom toast and the sweater that matched her eyes, who had spent 2 months quietly building a perfect day for someone else, standing alone at the waterfront, needing air. Everything okay? Oliver asked. Cleo looked up. Oliver Marsh was watching her with the patient, perceptive quality of someone who was paying genuine attention, and she thought, briefly, with a mixture of warmth and something like apology, that he was a genuinely good person, and she was very lucky that the date Vesper had chosen for her was with someone who was the kind of person who would look at her right now and ask if she was okay, rather than looking away. Yeah, she said. I'm sorry. I was just thinking about something. About the walk? About... She stopped. About someone who needed some air. A beat. Oliver looked at her with the careful attention of someone assembling information. He was, she thought, a more perceptive person than she'd initially given him credit for. He'd been listening this whole time, not just to what she said, but to the shape of what she wasn't saying, and she could see him now placing what he'd noticed into a framework that was becoming, in real time, coherent. "Tell me about her," he said, gently, without emphasis, as if it were an ordinary thing to say. Cleo looked at him. He met her eyes with an expression of uncomplicated kindness. She thought about 47 sketchbooks of love scenes she'd invented for other people. She thought about 48 blank pages. She thought about the small drawing in the corner of this morning's sketch, the familiar curve of a bent head, the escaped strand of hair, the quality of focus that looked like someone bracing for something they couldn't name. She thought, "I know that posture. I've been drawing it in margins for months without knowing that's what I was doing." She thought, she knew what color the sweater would make my eyes. She thought, she came by in the morning while I was still asleep and hung it up and didn't wake me. And what kind of love does that? What word is there for love that does that? "Her name is Vesper," Cleo said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "She planned this entire day." "I know," Oliver said. He picked up his wine glass. "I sort of thought she might have planned it for herself, actually." He said this without judgment, only with the neutral, observational quality of someone offering a perception they thought might be useful. In the way that people sometimes do things for other people when they can't figure out how to do them for themselves. Cleo looked at him. "That's very perceptive," she said. "I spend a lot of time outdoors," he said. "You notice things." She laughed, a real one, and he smiled. And it was easy between them. The ease of two people who had confirmed, without drama, that they were going to be friendly, but not this, and who were both mature enough to find that clarification a relief rather than a loss. "She's at the waterfront," Cleo said. "You should go find her," Oliver said simply. "We haven't finished." "Cleo." He said her name with the same practiced ease with which Vesper did, which made her feel, strangely, as if she'd known him longer than a morning. "The mushroom toast was excellent. You were right to recommend it. I think I got what I came for." She looked at him. "What did you come for?" He thought about this. "A good morning," he said. "A good walk. The feeling of someone paying real attention to me for a few hours." He paused. "That was all real, by the way. Even if the destination was already determined." "I did pay attention," she said honestly. "I know." He refilled her water glass, a small automatic gesture that was its own kind of kindness. "Go find your person, Clementine." She found her person at the waterfront. Vesper was standing at the railing where the path met the edge of the lake, looking out at the water with her back to the park. She'd let her hair down at some point. The chignon was gone, her hair loose around her shoulders, which was unusual for her in public. A small, unusual thing that Cleo noticed and filed. Her tablet was in her bag. Her hands were on the railing. The sky had changed in the last hour. Not dramatically, but in the way that Vermont autumn skies changed, with the casual caprice of a place that had strong meteorological opinions and no interest in advance notice. The clouds were coming in from the northwest, the particular heavy, gray-bottomed clouds that meant weather. The temperature had dropped 3 or 4 degrees. The light had shifted from honey to pewter. Vesper heard her footsteps on the path and turned, and the expression on her face in the fraction of a second before she composed it was the kind of expression that answered questions. "You're here," Vesper said. Her voice was controlled, but the control was visible now, a layer lying over something she was working to contain. "The lunch reservation isn't until..." "Vesper." Something in Cleo's voice. Vesper stopped. She looked at her. Not with the professional look, not with the event architect look, with the other look, the one she mostly kept at the back of her expression like a door she rarely opened. The one that was just present, attentive and uncertain and real. "What happened?" she said. Cleo walked to the railing. She stood beside her, close, their shoulders nearly touching in the way they'd been standing beside each other for 9 years. The comfortable proximity of people who had long since stopped calculating appropriate distance. She looked out at the lake. The water was moving now, small chop on the surface, the first indication of the weather coming. A heron. Possibly the same one from this morning, she thought. Or possibly a different one. Or possibly the same one because the universe occasionally arranged itself into patterns if you were paying attention. Stood motionless at the water's edge. Oliver Marsh is lovely, Cleo said. Good, Vesper said. Her voice was carefully level. He's thoughtful, and he pays attention, and he has good taste in film and a dog named after a Tarkovsky movie. Yes. He noticed, by the way, Cleo said, that you'd put a lot of work into this. A silence. He asked me to tell him about you, Cleo said. A longer silence. And, Vesper said. Her voice had changed, just slightly, just enough. Cleo turned to look at her. Vesper's jaw was slightly set. Her hands were on the railing with a tension that wasn't there when she was genuinely relaxed. Her eyes were on the lake, and the expression in them was. It was the expression she'd glimpsed at the back of the cafe. The one she'd been thinking about all morning, the one that looked like someone bracing. Vesper, Cleo said, quietly. Don't, Vesper said, and her voice was not sharp, not angry, just careful, as if she were crossing ice, and each word was a step she was placing precisely. Don't do this unless you know what you're doing. Cleo thought about 48 blank pages. She thought about the teal sweater and the dry cleaning and the morning key in the lock and the cool cup of coffee and the corner table with the best light for her eyes. She thought about 9 years of being known so completely that sometimes she forgot there was a version of herself that existed outside of Vesper's knowledge of her. She thought about what Oliver Marsh had said at the table over the mushroom toast. I sort of thought she might have planned it for herself, actually. I'm not on a date right now, Cleo said. I'm standing at a railing with the person I want to be standing at a railing with. The wind off the lake moved Vesper's hair. A cloud crossed the sun, changing the light on the water from pewter to dark glass. Somewhere behind them, the first rumble of distant weather. Too far to be thunder, just the sound of air moving through the mountains sending their advance notice. Vesper turned to look at her, and there was the expression, the real one, the one with nothing lying over it. Exposed and uncertain, and something underneath that Cleo recognized, with the absolute clarity of someone finally seeing what they'd been drawing in the margins for months, as the same thing she was feeling. I planned it for myself, Vesper said quietly. Her voice was stripped of its usual architectural certainty, down to something underneath that was human and undefended and, Cleo thought, very carefully maintained for a very long time. I know I planned it for myself. I kept telling myself it was for you, and it was. It genuinely was. I wanted... She stopped. Started again. I wanted you to have something perfect. And I wanted... She paused, and the pause contained everything. I wanted to know what that looked like. What you looked like, walking into it. What the morning light would do. Her hands tightened on the railing. I know what that is. Cleo looked at her. At this precise, devoted, controlled woman undoing the control in real time, one sentence at a time, at a railing at the edge of Lake Champlain while the weather came in from the mountains, at her best friend of 9 years, who had watched her walk into a cafe that she'd arranged, sat at the back so she couldn't be seen, who had needed air because she couldn't stay in the room for 3 hours, watching Cleo have the morning she'd designed and not be the one across the table. I've been drawing you, Cleo said, in the margins, for months. She looked at the lake. Without knowing I was doing it until I realized I was doing it, and then I tried to stop and I couldn't. A long silence. Cleo, Vesper said. Her voice was low and careful, and had entirely lost its event architecture quality. It sounded the way she sounded at 2 a.m. on the phone, when they were both tired enough to stop performing their better selves. I need you to say something specific. Cleo turned to look at her fully. I don't want to go to dinner with Oliver Marsh tonight, she said. I want to go to Il Giardino with the reservation you made and the private room you arranged, and I want to go with you. The wind, the lake, the first drop of rain on the railing, just one, then another. Vesper was looking at her with an expression that was unguarded. Cleo had seen Vesper vulnerable before, but always with something managed about it, always with the structural integrity of a person who knew how to hold their own weight. This was something different. This was the look of someone who had stopped holding. Okay, Vesper said. It came out like exhale, like the release of something held for a long time. The rain increased, not a downpour, but a solid, committed Vermont autumn rain, the kind that arrived with full intention and expected to stay. Vesper reached into her bag and pulled out an umbrella. Because of course she had an umbrella, she had everything. She had planned for the rain, and she opened it over both of them, and Cleo stepped closer into the shelter of it, and their shoulders touched properly now, not almost touching, but actually touching. It was exactly what it was,